rise of the Shepherd King, the weight of the crown. Welcome back to our journey through the chronicles of ancient Israel. In our previous study of 1 Samuel, we witnessed the tragic decline and ultimate fall of King Saul, a man who began with great promise but ended in paranoia and defeat on the slopes of Mount Gilboa. Today, we turn the page to a new chapter in redemptive history, the second book of Samuel. This is not just a book of history, it is a masterpiece of character study. It focuses almost entirely on one man, David. We will see him not just as the giant slayer or the harpist, but as a king, a flawed human being, and a man after God's own heart. In this first part, covering chapters 1 through 10, we witness David's meteoric rise to power, the unification of a fractured nation, and the establishment of a covenant that would echo through eternity. The king who mourns. The book opens not with a celebration, but with a funeral dirge. An Amalekite messenger arrives at David's camp in Ziklag, bearing the crown and armlet of Saul. He claims he delivered the final blow to the wounded king, hoping for a reward from David, Saul's rival. But David's reaction reveals his true character. Instead of rejoicing that his persecutor is dead, David is overcome with grief. He orders the execution of the messenger for daring to strike the Lord's anointed. For David, the office of the king was sacred, regardless of the man who held it. He then composes the Song of the Bow, a hauntingly beautiful lament. In it, David cries out, "How the mighty have fallen." He praises the bravery of Saul and his deep, brotherly love for Jonathan. This sets the tone for David's reign. It is built on honor, loyalty, and a profound respect for God's timing rather than political opportunism. A nation divided. The transition of power was far from seamless. While the tribe of Judah immediately anointed David as king in Hebron, the rest of the tribes followed Ishbosheth, Saul's remaining son, under the influence of the powerful general Abner. For over 7 years, a civil war simmered. But the text gives us a crucial observation. David grew stronger and stronger, while the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker. This wasn't just due to military prowess. It was a divine shifting of the tides. The narrative during these chapters is filled with Game of Thrones style, intrigue, betrayals, private vendettas, and the assassination of Abner and Ishbosheth. Crucially, David distances himself from these violent acts. When Ishbosheth's assassins bring his head to David, expecting a reward, David executes them. He refuses to build his kingdom on the blood of his brothers. He waits for the people to come to him, led by God, rather than forcing his way to the throne. The unification and the new capital. Finally, at the age of 30, all the tribes of Israel come to Hebron. They recognize the hand of God on David, saying, "The Lord said to you, 'You shall shepherd my people Israel.'" David is anointed king over all Israel, and for the first time since the conquest of Joshua, the nation is truly one. David immediately makes a brilliant strategic move. He captures the fortress of Zion from the Jebusites, a city that sat on the border between the northern and southern tribes. This city, Jerusalem, becomes the city of David. It is a neutral ground, a place where no single tribe can claim dominance, serving as the political and spiritual heartbeat of the nation, bringing the presence home. A king is only as strong as his connection to the King of Kings. David's first priority in his new capital is to bring the Ark of the Covenant, the footstool of God's presence, to Jerusalem. The first attempt ends in tragedy when Uzzah touches the Ark to steady it and is struck dead. David is terrified and angry, realizing that God's presence cannot be managed or treated with casual familiarity. God is holy, and his presence must be approached on his terms, not ours. Months later, with proper reverence and sacrifice, the ark is successfully brought into the city. Here we see one of the most famous images of David, the king of Israel, stripped of his royal robes, wearing a simple linen ephod, leaping and dancing with all his might before the Lord. When his wife Michal mocks his lack of dignity, David's response defines his spiritual posture. "I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become even more undignified than this. To David, God's glory was far more important than his own reputation. The eternal covenant. If chapter 6 is the spiritual peak, chapter 7 is the theological heart of the Bible. David, sitting in his palace of cedar, feels a holy discontent. He says to the prophet Nathan, "Here I am, living in a house of cedar, while the ark of God remains in a tent." David wants to build a house, a temple, for God. But that night, God speaks to Nathan with a stunning reversal. God says, in essence, "You will not build a house for me, I will build a house for you." God promises David a great name, like the patriarchs of old, a place for Israel, security and rest from their enemies, an eternal dynasty. "Your house and your kingdom shall endure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever." This is the Davidic covenant. It is the foundation of the messianic hope. When the New Testament begins, the very first line identifies Jesus as the Son of David. God's promise to a humble shepherd in Jerusalem becomes the bridge to the King of Kings, who would rule an eternal, spiritual kingdom. The expansion of grace. The following chapters depict the Golden Age in action. David defeats the Philistines, the Moabites, the Edomites, and the Ammonites. He brings justice and equity to his people, but the most touching story of this era is found in chapter 9. David asks, "Is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" This kindness, the Hebrew word is hesed, refers to a loyal, covenant love. He finds Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son, who was crippled in both feet and living in hiding. In that era, a new king would usually execute every member of the previous dynasty to prevent a rebellion. Instead, David brings Mephibosheth to his table. He restores all of Saul's land to him and says, "You shall eat at my table always." Mephibosheth's response is a picture of us all. "What is your servant, that you should notice a dead dog like me?" This chapter is a beautiful foreshadowing of the gospel, a king seeking out the broken and the marginalized, not to punish them, but to invite them to his royal table. By the end of chapter 10, David is at the zenith of his power. He is the beloved ruler of a unified nation, a conqueror of enemies, and the recipient of God's eternal promise. He has shown that a leader's true strength lies in their humility before God and their mercy toward the weak. But as we look at the horizon of chapter 11, a storm is gathering. The very success that David has enjoyed will become the fertile ground for his greatest failure. Join us in the next part as we witness the shadow that falls over the throne, the story of Bathsheba, a prophet's rebuke, and the consequences that would haunt David's family for generations. The shadow over the throne. The fragility of greatness. In our first part, we saw David at the pinnacle of human achievement. He was the shepherd king who unified a nation, established a capital, and received an eternal covenant from God. But history and the Bible is brutally honest. It does not hide the flaws of its heroes. Chapter 11 marks the most infamous turning point in biblical history. It is a story that proves that no one, no matter how spiritual or successful, is immune to the gravity of sin. It begins with a seemingly small decision that leads to a catastrophic collapse of character. The rooftop and the gaze. The narrative begins with a chilling sentence. In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David remained in Jerusalem. For years, David had been at the forefront of every battle, but success had brought a dangerous comfort. While his men, led by Joab, were risking their lives against the Ammonites, David was idle, and idleness is the playground of temptation. One evening, unable to sleep, David walked on the roof of his palace. From that height, he saw a woman bathing. Her name was Bathsheba. The text emphasizes her beauty. At this moment, David had a choice. He could have turned away, but he lingered. He inquired. He learned she was the wife of Uriah the Hittite, one of his most loyal, mighty men. Despite knowing she belonged to another, David used his royal power not to protect, but to take. He sent for her, and he slept with her. This was not a story of romance. It was an abuse of absolute power. Soon, the message came back to the palace. I am pregnant. The web of deceit. The man after God's own heart suddenly became a master of manipulation. To cover his tracks, David summoned Uriah from the front lines, hoping he would go home to his wife so the child could be claimed as his. But Uriah's integrity acted as a mirror to David's shame. Uriah refused to enjoy the comforts of home while his fellow soldiers were sleeping in open fields. He slept at the palace gate. David even tried to get him drunk, but Uriah's loyalty remained unshaken. In desperation, David committed a crime even more heinous than adultery. He sent Uriah back to the battlefield with a letter in his own hand, his own death warrant. He commanded Joab to place Uriah where the fighting was fiercest and then withdraw, leaving him to die. Uriah was murdered by the very king he was dying to protect. David then took Bathsheba as his wife, thinking the secret was buried. But the final verse of chapter 11 rings like a funeral bell. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. The parable and the rebuke. For nearly a year, David lived in silence, perhaps convincing himself he had gotten away with it. Then God sent the prophet Nathan. Nathan didn't accuse David directly at first. He told a story of a rich man with many sheep who stole the only beloved ewe lamb of a poor man to feed a guest. David, the former shepherd, was outraged. He cried out, "The man who did this must die." Then came the four most piercing words in Scripture. "You are the man." Nathan stripped away David's royal mask. He reminded David that God had given him everything, and yet he had despised the word of the Lord. The judgment was severe. Because David had used the sword to kill Uriah, the sword would never depart from his own house. Because he had sinned in secret, he would be humiliated in public. Repentance and the cost of grace. Unlike Saul, who offered excuses, David's response was immediate and raw. "I have sinned against the Lord." This moment of confession is the backdrop for Psalm 51, where David begs, "Create in me a pure heart, O God." God's grace was immediate. David would not die, but the consequences were inevitable. The child born of the affair fell ill. David fasted and wept on the ground for 7 days, pleading for the child's life. But the child died. In a display of profound faith, David washed himself, went into the house of the Lord to worship, and then ate. He accepted God's sovereignty and judgment. Later, Bathsheba gave birth to another son, Solomon, whom the Lord loved. Even in the midst of judgment, God was weaving a story of redemption. Ends with a sober reminder. David was forgiven, but the peace of the first 10 chapters was gone. The seed of lust and violence he had planted in the dark was about to grow into a harvest of thorns within his own family. Join us in part 3 as we see the tragic fulfillment of Nathan's prophecy through the rebellion of David's own children. The harvest of sorrow, the domino effect. If part 2 was the fall of the man, part 3 is the fall of the family and the kingdom. The grace of God is sufficient to save David's soul, but it does not cancel the earthly consequences of his actions. In the chapters that follow, we see David's sins of lust and murder mirrored in his children, creating a cycle of tragedy that nearly destroys the throne of Israel. The shadow in the house. The rot started with David's eldest son, Amnon. In a dark echo of his father's lust, Amnon became obsessed with his half-sister Tamar. He lured her into a trap and violated her. When David heard of it, he was furious, but he did nothing. Perhaps his own guilt with Bathsheba had paralyzed his ability to discipline his sons. Tamar's brother, Absalom, did not forget. He waited in cold, calculated silence for 2 years. Then, during a festival, he ordered his servants to murder Amnon. The sword had entered David's house. Absalom fled into exile, and though he was eventually allowed to return to Jerusalem, David refused to see his face for years. This fatherly neglect became the fuel for a revolution, the Great Rebellion. Absalom was the most handsome man in Israel, and he was as charismatic as he was ambitious. He sat at the city gates, stealing the hearts of the people by promising them the justice he claimed David was failing to provide. When the time was right, Absalom declared himself king in Hebron. The betrayal was so widespread that David, the aging lion, was forced to flee Jerusalem on foot, weeping as he climbed the Mount of Olives. The kingdom was split in two. David's loyalists faced Absalom's rebel army in the forest of Ephraim. David's only command to his generals was, "Be gentle with the young man Absalom for my sake." But Joab, David's ruthless general, knew that as long as Absalom lived, the kingdom would never be at peace. When Absalom's long hair got caught in the thick branches of a tree, leaving him hanging helplessly, Joab ignored the king's command and plunged 3 spears into Absalom's heart, the heart of a father. The victory was complete, but David's reaction was not one of a conqueror. He wailed in a room above the gate, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you." David's grief was so intense that it demoralized his troops. Joab had to sternly rebuke him, reminding him that his soldiers had risked their lives for him. David returned to the throne, but he was a broken man, presiding over a kingdom still fractured by tribal jealousies and minor rebellions, like that of Sheba. The epilogue, a king's legacy. The final 4 chapters of 2 Samuel function as a grand finale or an appendix. They are not in chronological order, but are arranged to give us a final look at David's life. Chapter 21 and 23. We read of David's mighty men, the heroes who performed supernatural feats of bravery. It reminds us that David's success was built on the backs of loyal men who believed in his vision. Chapter 22. This is a magnificent song of praise, almost identical to Psalm 18. David looks back on his life and declares, "The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer." He acknowledges that every victory was a gift from God. The final altar. The book ends with a strange and difficult story. David, moved by pride, ordered a census to count his fighting men. It was a sin of self-reliance, trusting in the size of his army rather than the power of God. A plague struck Israel as a result. Distraught, David pleaded with God to strike him instead of the people. He was instructed to build an altar on the threshing floor of Araunah. When Araunah offered to give the land for free, David made a profound statement. "I will not offer burnt offerings to the Lord my God that cost me nothing." David bought the land and offered the sacrifice. The plague stopped. This location, bought in a moment of repentance, would become the very site where Solomon would build the great temple of Jerusalem. The second book of Samuel ends not with a perfect king, but with a repentant one. David's story is a powerful reminder that our greatest strengths can become our greatest weaknesses if we lose our dependence on God. David was a warrior, a poet, a king, and a sinner. But through it all, he was a man who kept coming back to the altar. His life points forward to a greater king, one who would also be born in Bethlehem, who would also be betrayed by his own, but who would never fall. Thank you for joining us through the dramatic history of 2 Samuel. If this study has enriched your understanding, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. What part of David's life speaks to you the most? Until next time, keep seeking the heart of the true king.